The scream tore through the sterile air, a raw animal sound that cut through the cacophony of the ER like a scalpel. Amelia, Amy Vance didn't flinch. Her hands, nimble and sure, continued to stabilize the IV drip in Mrs. Rodriguez's trembling arm. Mrs. Rodriguez, a woman whose eyes held the haunted resignation of a chronic patient, watched Amy with a quiet intensity. The scream came again, closer this time, followed by the urgent, clipped tones of a doctor calling for a pediatric trauma consult. Amy glanced at the clock. 3 a.m. Another graveyard shift bleeding into dawn, a relentless cycle of adrenaline and exhaustion. She was 26, her frame slight but deceptively strong, her auburn hair usually pulled back in a no-nonsense ponytail, though a few rebellious strands had escaped to frame her tired but determined face. Her eyes, a warm hazel, held a deep well of empathy that often blurred the lines between professional detachment and genuine human connection. "Almost done here, Mrs. Rodriguez," Amy murmured, her voice a soothing counterpoint to the hospital's harsh symphony. "Just a few more minutes for the fluids to run, and then we'll get you settled back upstairs." Mrs. Rodriguez managed a weak smile. "You're a good one, Amy. Always calm, even when the world's falling apart." Amy returned the smile, a fleeting moment of connection. But the ER never stayed calm for long. A gurney, moving at a controlled sprint, rounded the corner, carrying a child no older than 5. The boy's face was pale, streaked with dirt and blood, his arm bent at an unnatural angle. His mother, frantic, stumbled alongside, whispering prayers. Pediatric trauma, fractured radius, possible concussion, fall from a second-story window, Dr. Chen rattled off, his voice tight with urgency. "Nurse Vance, can you assist with stabilization?" "On it, Dr. Chen," Amy replied, her fatigue evaporating instantly. She quickly handed Mrs. Rodriguez's care over to a junior nurse and moved with practiced efficiency towards the new patient. Her mind, a finely tuned instrument, was already assessing, prioritizing. "Hey there, buddy," she said softly to the whimpering child, her voice shifting to a gentle register. She didn't patronize him, but spoke with a quiet confidence that was designed to reassure. "My name's Amy. We're going to help you, okay? We're going to make that arm feel much better." As Dr. Chen began to examine the boy, Amy moved to his mother. "He's in good hands, ma'am. Dr. Chen is excellent. We need to get some details from you now, just so we can help him the best we can." Her questions were precise, her tone compassionate yet firm, guiding the distraught woman through the necessary information. She assisted Dr. Chen in carefully splinting the boy's arm, her movements fluid and exact, her eyes constantly scanning for any changes in his condition. After an hour, the boy was stable, sedated, and on his way to radiology. Amy allowed herself a deep breath, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. It was these moments, the small victories snatched from the jaws of chaos, that kept her coming back. Her moment of peace was short-lived. A brisk, no-nonsense footsteps echoed down the hallway. Dr. Evelyn Reed, the head of nursing for the ER, appeared, her silver hair pulled into a severe bun, her expression perpetually etched with a blend of professional skepticism and thinly veiled disapproval. Dr. Reed was a stickler for protocol, a woman who believed that the hospital operated on rules, not on instinct or gut feelings. "Nurse Vance, a moment, please," Dr. Reed said, her voice devoid of warmth. Amy felt a familiar tightening in her stomach. "Yes, Dr. Reed? I've just reviewed the charts for Mr. Davies in Bay 3, Reed began, her eyes narrowing slightly. "He was admitted with acute abdominal pain, suspected appendicitis. You administered a low dose of antiemetic without explicit physician orders. While Dr. Chen later approved it, your initial action deviated from established protocol. He hadn't even finished his initial assessment." Amy felt a flush rise to her cheeks. "Dr. Reed, Mr. Davies was vomiting profusely and in extreme distress. He couldn't even answer Dr. Chen's questions coherently. I knew the antiemetic would alleviate his symptoms enough for the doctor to complete his assessment more effectively and expedite his diagnosis. It was a judgment call to aid the patient." Dr. Reed's gaze was unyielding. "Judgment calls, Nurse Vance, are often liabilities. We operate within clear, defined parameters for a reason. Every deviation, however well-intentioned, opens us up to risk. The hospital's risk. Your risk. You had no right to operate outside the lines. Next time, wait for the order. Is that understood?" "Yes, Dr. Reed," Amy murmured, her jaw tight. She understood the rules, but sometimes the rules felt like they suffocated the very humanity they were meant to protect. "Doctor." Reed's lecture was a stark reminder of the bureaucratic walls that often stood between her and simply doing what felt right. It felt like a subtle warning. Your compassion will be your downfall. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of urgent beeps, hurried footsteps, and the low hum of medical machinery. By the time her shift ended, the eastern sky was already a pale rose, promising a beautiful, if unappreciated, dawn. Amy trudged out of the hospital, the metallic scent of antiseptics clinging to her clothes, the weight of the last 12 hours heavy on her shoulders. "I need a break," she muttered to herself, pulling out her phone. The incessant demands, the constant stress, the bureaucratic friction with Dr. Reed, it was all building up. She scrolled through her browser history, finding the ferry company website she'd looked at a few weeks ago. A weekend getaway. A small, charming coastal town, just a couple of hours away by ferry. No urgent care, no protocols, just ocean air and the quiet rhythm of the waves. Within minutes, she'd booked a ticket for the Star of the Sound, a morning departure. A small indulgence, a necessary escape. She pictured herself sitting on the deck, feeling the sun on her face, the salt spray refreshing her skin. Pure, uncomplicated peace. Later that afternoon, after a few hours of much-needed sleep, Amy packed a small duffel bag. Inside, alongside her clothes and a book she hadn't had time to read, she placed a compact, well-stocked first aid kit. It was an old habit, almost an unconscious ritual. A childhood spent camping with her wilderness-loving father had instilled in her a deep respect for preparedness, a belief that it was always better to have the tools and not need them than to need them and not have them. Even though she was going on a relaxing trip, her nurse's instinct, the part of her that always anticipated need, ensured the kit found its place in her bag. The irony, she would later realize, was profound. She was seeking escape, but her very essence, her nature as a caregiver, was preparing her for the very thing she was trying to avoid. She closed the zipper, completely unaware that this small, mundane act was setting the stage for the defining moment of her life. The morning air was crisp, carrying the briny scent of the sea and the faint tang of diesel fuel from the ferry's engines. Amy stood on the upper deck of the Star of the Sound, clutching a steaming cup of coffee. The sun, a bright copper coin, was just beginning its ascent, painting the water with shimmering streaks of gold. The ferry, a sturdy vessel with a freshly painted hull, sliced through the gentle waves with a comforting, rhythmic thrum. This was exactly what she needed. The hospital, with its fluorescent lights and constant emergencies, felt a world away. Here, the only pressing demand was the call of the seagulls circling overhead. Around her, the deck was a tableau of varied humanity. A young family with two boisterous children chased each other, their laughter carried on the wind. An elderly couple sat hand in hand, gazing out at the horizon, their faces etched with a lifetime of shared experiences. Commuters, buried in newspapers or absorbed in their phones, occupied the rows of seats, their expressions a mixture of weary routine and quiet anticipation. Tourists, cameras slung around their necks, pointed at distant lighthouses and picturesque islands. Amy watched them all, a quiet observer, feeling a rare sense of anonymity and peace. For 2 hours, she was just Amy, a passenger, not a nurse. She leaned against the railing, feeling the gentle sway of the ship, the cool breeze on her face. The vast expanse of the ocean stretched out before her, an endless canvas of blues and greens. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply, letting the salt air cleanse the lingering exhaustion from her lungs. This was rejuvenation. This was freedom. An hour passed in this serene manner. The ferry was nearing the halfway point of its journey, the coastline a receding smudge behind them, the destination port still a distant promise. Amy had just finished her coffee and was considering going inside to read her book when it happened. It wasn't a gradual tremor, but a sudden, violent shudder that ripped through the entire vessel. It felt like the ship had slammed into an invisible wall. A horrifying sound of screeching, tearing metal echoed from deep within the hull, a sound so unnatural and violent that it seemed to tear the very fabric of the tranquil morning. Amy was thrown forward, stumbling against the railing, narrowly avoiding a nasty fall. The coffee cup clattered to the deck, spilling its last cold drops. A collective gasp rose from the passengers, quickly followed by a stunned silence. For a split second, everyone froze, their minds struggling to comprehend what had just transpired. Then, chaos erupted. The ship began to list immediately, a slow, sickening tilt to port. Alarms, shrill and piercing, began to blare, cutting through the stunned silence. A woman screamed, a high-pitched primal sound that ignited the panic. "What was that?" someone yelled. "We hit something," another shouted, their voice laced with terror. The children, moments ago full of laughter, were now crying, their innocent faces contorted with fear. Parents frantically grabbed their kids, their eyes wide with dawning horror. Commuters scrambled out of their seats, dropping briefcases and newspapers. The elderly couple, who had been so serene, now clung to each other, their faces pale. Amy's heart hammered against her ribs, a rapid, frantic drumbeat. Her breath caught in her throat. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She was just another passenger, adrift on a now damaged vessel, miles from shore. But then, the instinct kicked in. The years of training, the countless emergencies, the ingrained reflex to assess and assist, it overrode the fear. Her mind, usually so precise in an ER, now had to adapt to a far less controlled environment. She scanned the deck, her eyes rapidly cataloging the unfolding disaster. People were falling as the deck continued to tilt. Luggage tumbled, chairs slid, adding to the general confusion and panic. A man, probably in his late 40s, lay sprawled near the railing, a dark crimson stain spreading rapidly on his forehead, where he had struck it against a metal stanchion. His eyes were glazed, unfocused. Near him, a young woman cradled her arm, her face contorted in agony. The angle of her forearm was clearly unnatural, a compound fracture. Her companion, a frantic young man, hovered uselessly, his own panic making him ineffective. A child, one of the two from the family Amy had watched earlier, lay motionless near a bench, likely knocked unconscious by the sudden impact. His mother was screaming his name, trying to reach him, but was herself pinned by a toppled vending machine. Crew members, clearly overwhelmed, were scrambling. Some were shouting instructions. "Everyone, to the life raft stations!" But their voices were drowned out by the rising tide of fear and the shrill alarms. Others were trying to dislodge life rafts, their movements jerky and desperate. The sense of control, of professional order, had completely evaporated. Amy didn't hesitate. She didn't consciously decide. She simply acted. Her legs, propelled by an unseen force, moved her towards the injured. While others were screaming and scrambling for life vests, Amy instinctively ran towards the danger, a human magnet drawn to suffering. Her first stop was the man with the head injury. "Sir, can you hear me?" she called, kneeling beside him. No response. His breathing was shallow. She gently checked his pulse, strong but thready. She knew she needed to control the bleeding and keep him stable. Her gaze darted around, searching for anything at all. Her eyes landed on her duffel bag, which had skittered across the deck and was now lodged against a bench. The first aid kit. Thank God. She scrambled towards it, fumbling with the zipper with shaking hands. Inside, a familiar array of bandages, antiseptic wipes, gauze, and tape. A small, anachronistic island of order in a sea of chaos. She tore open a sterile gauze pad and pressed it firmly against the bleeding wound on the man's forehead. "Hold this, sir," she instructed, her voice calm and firm, cutting through the rising din. He didn't respond, but his hand instinctively went to the pressure, a weak, uncoordinated movement. Next, the woman with the broken arm. "Ma'am, I'm a nurse. Can I help you?" Amy asked, her voice projecting confidence she didn't entirely feel. The woman, tears streaming down her face, nodded frantically. "It hurts. Oh God, it hurts so bad." Amy quickly assessed the arm. A clean break, but the bone was visibly protruding. This needed immediate stabilization to prevent further injury and manage pain. She searched for splinting material. A discarded metal magazine rack lay nearby. Not ideal, but it would work. She tore strips of fabric from the seat cushions. A shocking act of destruction in normal circumstances, but here, an act of improvisation and necessity. With practiced hands, she fashioned a makeshift splint, gently immobilizing the limb, trying to minimize the excruciating pain. "Deep breaths, just breathe," she coached, her hand on the woman's shoulder. "We'll get you off this boat. You're going to be okay." Her eyes then fell on the unconscious child. The mother was still screaming, trapped by the vending machine. Amy quickly checked the mother, seeing a superficial cut but no major injuries. "Stay calm, ma'am. I'm going to help your son," she yelled over the pandemonium. She moved to the boy, gently checking his airway, his pulse. His breathing was shallow but steady. A nasty bruise was forming on his temple. Possible concussion. She needed to keep him still, monitor his consciousness. By now, the list of the ferry was more pronounced. The deck was a terrifying slope. The PA system crackled to life. The captain's voice, strained but audible, reiterating, "Abandon ship. All passengers, proceed to the life raft stations. Abandon ship." Amy knew her time was running out. She was not a rescuer. She was a nurse. Her job was to care. And here, in the midst of this terrifying, sinking vessel, she had 3 critical patients who desperately needed her. She couldn't move them alone. She couldn't leave them. She quickly established a small, makeshift triage center in a semi-sheltered part of the main cabin, near a wall that offered some stability. She directed a terrified but lucid passenger, who seemed to be in shock but otherwise uninjured, to help her move the bleeding man and the child to this spot. She continued to work feverishly, her mind a whirlwind of medical assessments and improvised solutions, her hands moving with a purpose born of years of training. The chaos raged around her, but in her small, desperate corner of the sinking ship, Amy Vance was a beacon of calm and competence, a single, determined nurse fighting against the encroaching tide of disaster. The abandoned ship command continued to blare, a relentless, siren-like wail that seemed to amplify the terror. The list of the ferry was now so severe that walking was a perilous struggle. People stumbled and slid, grasping at railings and anything fixed to the floor. The horizon outside the windows was a dizzying, canted line, the blue sky meeting the churning gray water at an impossible angle. Below deck, the sounds were more ominous, the creaking and groaning of stressed metal, the gurgle and roar of water rushing into breaches. On the main deck, water was already sloshing in through shattered windows and breached doors, pooling quickly, icy cold against Amy's sneakers. The air, once filled with the fresh scent of the ocean, was now heavy with the smell of diesel, salt water, and the metallic tang of fear. Amy, her face streaked with dirt and sweat, knelt beside an elderly man, Mr. Henderson, who had been brought to her makeshift triage area. He had a severe compound fracture in his leg, the bone visibly protruding through the skin. His face was ashen, his lips tinged blue, and his breathing was shallow and rapid, clear signs of shock. She had managed to control the bleeding and improvise a more secure splint, using a discarded floor tile and more strips of fabric, but his condition was deteriorating. He needed a hospital, not a sinking ship. "Mr. Henderson, can you hear me?" Amy asked, her voice urgent but gentle. He moaned faintly, his eyes fluttering open, wide with terror. "We're going to get you out of here, okay? Just try to stay with me." She was aware of the dwindling number of people around her. Most passengers and uninjured crew had already made their way to the life raft stations, pushed by desperate self-preservation. Only a handful of people remained, primarily those like Amy's patients, too injured, too disoriented, or too overwhelmed to move. A crew member, a young man with panic in his eyes, stumbled into their section. He was helping guide a few last stragglers towards the stern where the final life rafts were being deployed. He saw Amy, surrounded by the injured, working feverishly. "Nurse! We have to go now!" he yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. "The last raft! It's leaving in minutes! The ship is going down!" Amy looked up, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. She glanced at Mr. Henderson, whose eyes, dull with pain and shock, fixed on her. She saw the fear there, the profound helplessness. Moving him now, in his condition, onto a chaotic life raft would likely kill him. He was barely clinging to life. He needed to be kept still, warm, and constantly monitored. The jostling, the cold, the sheer terror of being pushed into a crowded raft, it would be too much. She thought of her training, of the Hippocratic Oath, of every single instinct that had ever guided her. Her responsibility was to her patients. To leave them now was unthinkable. It went against every fiber of her being. "I'm not leaving him," she yelled back, her voice hoarse but resolute, surprising even herself with its fierce conviction. "He won't survive the transfer. He's in shock." The crew member hesitated, torn between his duty to evacuate everyone and the desperate plea in her eyes. The ship groaned again, a louder, more terrifying sound this time, a sound that spoke of imminent collapse. "You'll die if you stay," he screamed, his face contorted. "I'm not leaving," Amy repeated, her voice now dangerously calm, final. He stood there for another agonizing second, his eyes darting between Amy and the rapidly listing deck. Then, with a desperate, despairing shout, he turned and ran, disappearing towards the stern, presumably to catch the last life raft. And then silence, or rather, the silence of profound abandonment. The blare of the PA system had finally cut out. The last of the desperate screams faded. The only sounds now were the terrifying symphony of the dying ship. The rushing water, the groaning metal, the gentle lapping of waves against the now submerged deck outside. Amy was alone, or rather, alone with her patients. Besides Mr. Henderson, she still had the young woman with the broken arm, now shivering uncontrollably but conscious, and the unconscious child, whose breathing remained steady but shallow. There were also two other passengers, less severely injured but too disoriented to have made their escape, huddling together against a bulkhead, their eyes wide with numb terror. The feeling of being utterly, completely alone on a sinking vessel was overwhelming. The cold seeped into her bones. The realization that she had just made a choice that could cost her life settled like a lead weight in her stomach. Fear tried to creep back in to paralyze her. She pushed it down. She had no time for fear. She had patience. "Okay," she said aloud, her voice surprisingly steady, though it wavered slightly on the last word. She wasn't just talking to her patients. She was talking to herself, anchoring herself in her purpose. "Okay, we're going to keep fighting. We're going to stay warm, and we're going to stay together." She went back to Mr. Henderson, checking his pulse again, trying to keep him lucid. "Mr. Henderson, can you tell me your name again?" she asked, repeating the question she'd asked before, trying to prompt a response. He moaned. "It's Robert," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "That's right, Robert. You're doing great, Robert. Just stay with me." She began to rummage through abandoned bags, finding a few stray blankets, a couple of jackets. She carefully covered her patients, trying to conserve their body heat. The water was now lapping at the lower edges of the cabin, an ominous, creeping tide. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Each groan of the ship felt like its last. Each dip and sway of the deck sent a jolt of terror through her. She checked her watch. It felt like hours, but only 20 minutes had passed since the last raft had left. She continuously monitored the child, checking his pupils, his responsiveness, whispering reassurances to his mother who was now beside them, still shaken but trying to be brave. She spoke calmly to the woman with the broken arm, distracting her from the pain with gentle questions about her life, her family, anything to keep her mind off their predicament. Her eyes constantly scanned the horizon, desperate for a sign. A boat, a helicopter, anything, the Coast Guard. They had to be coming. Someone must have radioed for help. But the vast, indifferent ocean offered no comfort, only endless blue. She kept talking. A low, steady stream of medical instructions, reassurances, and observations, not just for her patients but for herself. It was her way of holding on to sanity, of maintaining a semblance of control in a situation that was utterly uncontrollable. The ship lurched violently again, a deep, resonating crack that reverberated through the very structure. The lights flickered, then died, plunging them into a terrifying semi-darkness, illuminated only by the faint light filtering through the water-streaked windows. The auxiliary power must have failed. Fear, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm her. This was it. This was the end. But then she looked at Mr. Henderson, his eyes wide and pleading. She looked at the child, so vulnerable. She looked at the two other passengers, cowering, their faces etched with despair. They were depending on her. She was all they had. She took a deep breath, pushing the fear back down, deep inside, where it could not paralyze her. "It's okay," she said, her voice wavering slightly, but holding firm. "We're going to be okay, just hold on." Another long, agonizing minute. The ship listed even further. Water was now flowing freely into the cabin, chilling them to the bone. Amy pulled a blanket higher over Mr. Henderson, trying to shield him from the encroaching cold. And then, a sound. Faint at first, a distant thrum. She strained her ears, hoping, praying. It grew louder, more distinct. The unmistakable thumping of rotor blades. "Listen!" she exclaimed, her voice cracking with relief, pointing towards a faint flicker of light in the distant sky. "Listen! They're here! The Coast Guard!" The sound grew into a roaring crescendo. A powerful searchlight cut through the gloom, sweeping across the water, then finally, brilliantly, settling on their section of the ferry. A Coast Guard helicopter, a magnificent beast of rescue, hovered directly overhead, its downdraft whipping the remaining debris around them. Tears, hot and unstoppable, streamed down Amy's face. She didn't even realize she was crying until the relief hit her with the force of a physical blow. They were safe. She had done it. She had stayed, and they were alive. A rescue swimmer was lowered, quickly followed by a stretcher. With incredible speed and efficiency, the Coast Guard team began the perilous process of winching the injured from the nearly submerged deck. Mr. Second State. Henderson was the first to go, carefully secured onto the stretcher, then lifted away. Amy watched him go, a silent prayer of thanks forming on her lips. Finally, it was her turn. The rescue swimmer, a burly man with kind eyes, gave her a reassuring nod. "You did good, nurse. Real good." Amy could only nod, numb with exhaustion and relief. She was secured into the harness, feeling the strong hands of the rescuer. As she was lifted, slowly, steadily, away from the groaning, dying ship, she took one last look. The Star of the Sound was sinking fast, its deck now barely visible above the waves. It was a testament to both human tragedy and human resilience. She had chosen to stay on a sinking ferry to treat the wounded, and now she was flying away, a survivor, a hero, though she felt anything but. The immediate aftermath was a blur of flashing lights, urgent questions, and the welcome warmth of dry blankets. Amy was whisked away to a nearby hospital, not as a patient, but for a routine checkup. The physical exhaustion was profound, but the emotional release was almost overwhelming. The Coast Guard personnel, the paramedics, even the hospital staff, treated her with a mixture of awe and respect. "You saved those people, Nurse Vance?" a Coast Guard officer told her, his voice rough with admiration. "Especially Robert Henderson. Another 10 minutes, he wouldn't have made it." The news spread like wildfire. Local media outlets, starved for a human interest story amidst the tragedy, latched onto Amy's heroism. "Young nurse stays on sinking ferry to save lives," screamed the headlines. "Angel on the Star of the Sound." Photos of her, exhausted but resolute, being winched from the ship, appeared everywhere. The families of the survivors she had helped flooded her with calls and messages of profound gratitude. Robert Henderson's daughter, a tenacious lawyer named Sarah Jenkins, tearfully thanked her, promising to do anything she could to help. Amy felt a profound sense of peace and validation. She had faced death and chosen to serve life. It was, she thought, the proudest moment of her professional career. But the tide, as it often does, began to turn. The first subtle ripples of discontent came from Oceanic Transit, the ferry company. They were facing an avalanche of lawsuits, investigations, and public scrutiny over the ferry's sinking. Arthur Sterling, the senior executive and legal counsel for Oceanic Transit, was a man whose expensive suits perfectly matched the icy precision of his mind. He saw Amy Vance not as a hero, but as a dangerous variable, a PR nightmare, and a potential legal liability that needed to be neutralized. "This hero-nurse narrative is complicating matters," Sterling stated in a closed-door meeting with his PR team, his voice clipped and devoid of emotion. "She acted without authority. What if her interventions caused more harm than good? What if her unauthorized presence interfered with evacuation efforts? We need to shift the focus, undermine her credibility." Within days, a thinly veiled article appeared in a local, less scrupulous online news portal, clearly planted by Oceanic Transit's PR machine. The headline was innocuous: "Questions arise over ferry rescue protocols." But the content was insidious. It quoted anonymous sources close to the investigation, suggesting that an unauthorized and unqualified individual had taken command on the sinking vessel, potentially violating established maritime safety procedures and hindering organized evacuation efforts. It subtly implied that by Amy's reckless actions, she might have put other passengers and crew at risk. The article never explicitly named Amy, but the context was unmistakably clear. The rage bait had begun. Amy read the article, her blood running cold. She felt a sickening lurch in her stomach. Her initial euphoria evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of dread. Then came the summons from her own hospital. Not a commendation, not a celebration, but a formal letter requesting her presence at an internal review meeting regarding her conduct during the ferry incident. The language was sterile, bureaucratic, and utterly devoid of any recognition of her heroism. The meeting took place 2 days later in a small, windowless conference room. Present were Dr. Evelyn Reed, Amy's supervisor, looking even more severe than usual, and Mr. Henderson, the hospital's legal counsel, a stoic man with a perpetually grave expression. Amy walked in, her heart pounding, expecting at least a pat on the back, perhaps a gentle reminder about protocols. What she received was a chilling interrogation. Dr. Reed began, her voice a monotone of professional disapproval. "Nurse Vance, We've reviewed the preliminary reports regarding the incident on the Star of the Sound. We understand the circumstances were highly unusual. A pause, but no warmth. However, your actions raise several serious concerns regarding professional conduct and hospital liability. Amy stared, bewildered. Hospital liability? I saved lives, Dr. Reed. I stayed because people would have died otherwise. Mr. Henderson, the lawyer, spoke, his voice dry. Miss Vance, while we appreciate your dedication, you acted outside your designated authority as a hospital employee. You were off duty. You had no right to perform triage or administer medical aid in an uncontrolled, non-hospital environment without explicit orders from a supervising physician. You were operating without the protection of the hospital's malpractice insurance. Do you understand the implications of this? Amy felt a surge of indignation. Implications? The implication was that people were dying. My license, my training, demanded that I act. Am I supposed to stand by and watch a man bleed out because I'm not on the clock? Dr. Reed leaned forward, her eyes narrowed. You were not performing your duties as a hospital nurse. You were a passenger. Any medical interventions you performed, however well-intentioned, were done without the proper chain of command, without access to full medical records, and without the appropriate equipment. What if you had made a mistake? What if your aide had exacerbated an injury? What if you had moved Mr. Henderson incorrectly and caused further damage to his fractured leg? This hospital would be liable. You, personally, would be liable. You put this hospital's name and insurance at risk. What you did was reckless, Nurse Vance, not heroic. Each word was a stinging blow, designed to dismantle her confidence, to twist her noble actions into an act of dangerous recklessness. The sheer, infuriating pettiness of it all made her blood boil. They were dissecting her life-saving decisions with the cold, unfeeling blade of legal jargon and bureaucratic protocol. So, what are you saying? Amy asked, her voice tight with suppressed anger. We are saying, Dr. Reed concluded, her face impassive, that effective immediately, you are suspended without pay, pending a full internal investigation into your conduct. We will review all statements, all reports, and determine if your actions constitute a breach of professional ethics and hospital policy. You are to surrender your badge and keys. Amy stared at them, stunned. Suspension, for saving lives. The injustice of it was a physical ache in her chest. She had envisioned accolades, not this. This wasn't just a reprimand. It was an attempt to erase her heroism, to punish her for daring to act beyond the confines of their rigid system. The rage began to simmer within her, but the indignity didn't end there. The state authorities, spurred by the ferry company's legal team, launched their own investigation into the incident. Amy received another summons, this time from the State Department of Transportation and the local police department. She sat in a cramped interview room, facing two stony-faced investigators. Detective Miller, a gruff man with tired eyes, and Miss Chen, a meticulously dressed woman from the DOT. Their tone was not openly accusatory, but it was impersonal, clinical, and utterly dehumanizing. They weren't interested in her courage. They were interested in facts, procedures, and potential breaches. Miss Vance, can you confirm your exact location at the moment of impact? Detective Miller began, his voice flat. I was on the upper deck, near the railing, Amy replied, trying to keep her voice steady. And you proceeded to the main cabin where you began administering medical aid? Miss Chen interjected, flipping through a file. Who gave you the authority to take command, Miss Vance? Were you deputized? Did a crew member request your medical assistance? No one deputized me, Amy retorted, the edge of frustration creeping into her voice. People were injured, critically. I'm a nurse. My training compelled me to act. Training is one thing, Miss Vance, Miller pressed. Legal authority is another. Were you aware of the specific state laws regarding emergency medical aid by off-duty personnel on a commercial vessel? Did you have a copy of the maritime safety protocols for the Star of the Sound? Of course not, Amy exclaimed, incredulous. I was a passenger. I was saving lives. Are you saying I should have consulted a legal textbook while a child was unconscious and an old man was bleeding out? Miss Chen meticulously noted something in her pad. Your actions, Miss Vance, however well-intentioned, could be viewed as interfering with the certified crew's evacuation efforts. Can you prove your actions didn't hinder the evacuation? What if your presence in the main cabin diverted crew resources? Amy felt a burning anger ignite within her. They were twisting everything. Her courage, her compassion, her life-saving actions, all being picked apart, scrutinized, and recontextualized into potential negligence or interference. She was being treated not as a hero, but as a reckless amateur, a liability, a criminal suspect. The weight of the system, the cold, unfeeling bureaucratic machine, was crushing her. It was precisely what Arthur Sterling and Oceanic Transit wanted. The rage bait was working. The viewers, Amy thought, would be seething. The days following her suspension and the grueling interrogations blurred into a haze of despair and impotent fury. Amy found herself adrift, caught in a Kafkaesque nightmare where doing the right thing was being punished, and the systems designed to protect were actively working against her. Her phone, once buzzing with messages of support, had quieted. The media, having moved on to the next sensational story, had largely forgotten her. She was isolated, her career in jeopardy, her reputation smeared by corporate whispers and bureaucratic doublespeak. She began to doubt herself. Had she been reckless? Had her instincts, so clear and urgent in the moment, actually crossed some invisible line? The relentless barrage of questions from Dr. Reed, Mr. Henderson, and the state investigators chipped away at her conviction. The weight of it all was crushing. She walked through her small apartment, the silence amplifying the echo of their accusations, the reckless, unauthorized, unqualified labels ringing in her ears. Just as the darkness threatened to consume her, a lifeline appeared, from an unexpected quarter. Her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. Reluctantly, she answered. "Hello? Amy Vance? My name is Sarah Jenkins. My father is Robert Henderson. You saved his life." The voice on the other end was firm, clear, and brimming with a quiet determination. "I heard what the hospital is doing, and what Oceanic Transit is trying to spin. It's disgusting, and it's wrong." Amy felt a flicker of hope. "Miss Jenkins, call me Sarah, and I'm a lawyer, a damned good one if I do say so myself, and I intend to represent you pro bono. No charge. Consider it my father's way of paying you back, and my way of fighting for what's right." Amy felt a lump form in her throat. "Sarah, I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything yet. Just tell me everything. Every detail. From the moment the ship shuddered to the moment you were airlifted off. Don't leave anything out." Amy, bolstered by this sudden, fierce ally, recounted the entire ordeal. Sarah listened intently, interjecting with sharp, pertinent questions. She was a bulldog, Amy realized, with a mind like a steel trap. Simultaneously, another unlikely ally emerged. One of the Coast Guard rescue swimmers, a burly, no-nonsense veteran named Petty Officer First Class David Ramirez, had been reading the insidious articles and hearing the whispers. He had been the one who had told Amy, "You did good, nurse, real good." He was disgusted by the attempts to discredit her. He believed in doing what was right, not just following orders. Discreetly, Ramirez contacted a journalist he respected, an old-school reporter for a major regional newspaper named Mark Harrison. Harrison was known for his integrity and his tenacious pursuit of the truth, often clashing with corporate interests and political figures. "Harrison, I got a story for you," Ramirez said, his voice low and serious over the phone. "About that ferry sinking. Everyone's focused on Oceanic Transit's cover-up, and that's important. But there's a hero in all this, and they're trying to crucify her." Harrison, intrigued, met with Ramirez. The Coast Guard officer laid out the facts, the raw, unfiltered truth of what he had witnessed. Amy Vance, a lone nurse, refusing to abandon critically injured passengers, holding vigil on a sinking ship until the last possible moment. He described her calm competence, her unwavering resolve. Meanwhile, Sarah Jenkins was a whirlwind of legal action. She immediately fired off letters to the hospital and the state investigators, demanding transparency and evidence. More importantly, she began gathering sworn affidavits. She contacted every single survivor Amy had treated, from Robert Henderson, now recovering in the hospital, to the child's mother, to the woman with the broken arm, and even the two disoriented passengers who had huddled with Amy. Each affidavit was a powerful testament, a detailed, first-hand account of Amy's life-saving actions. Robert Henderson's testimony was particularly poignant, describing Amy's unwavering presence as he drifted in and out of consciousness, her calm voice anchoring him, her hands, steady and strong, holding him together. The child's mother tearfully recounted how Amy had monitored her son, providing comfort when no one else could. Mark Harrison, the journalist, armed with Ramirez's testimony and the growing stack of survivor affidavits that Sarah had begun sharing, with Amy's permission, delved deeper. He uncovered Oceanic Transit's history of maintenance violations, their cutting of corners on crew training, and a pattern of prioritizing profit over safety. He saw the cynical corporate playbook at work: blame the hero to deflect from your own negligence. He published his article, not in some obscure online portal, but on the front page of the regional paper. The headline was stark, uncompromising. Hero or scapegoat? The unjust persecution of the Angel of the Sound. The article brilliantly contrasted Oceanic Transit's carefully crafted narrative with the raw, emotional testimonies of the survivors, alongside Ramirez's authoritative account. It exposed Arthur Sterling's calculated PR strategy and the hospital's cowardly, bureaucratic response. It laid bare the infuriating injustice of it all. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The rage bait had worked, but not in the way Arthur Sterling had intended. The public, already primed for outrage by the initial corporate spin, now had a clear villain and an undeniable hero. Social media exploded. People were disgusted by Oceanic Transit, furious at the hospital, and rallied unequivocally behind Amy. The tide had truly turned. The public outcry was a tsunami. Phone lines at Oceanic Transit and the hospital switchboard were jammed. Emails flooded in, demanding justice for Amy Vance. The pressure was immense, undeniable. Arthur Sterling, who had so confidently orchestrated Amy's downfall, now watched in horror as his meticulously crafted smear campaign backfired spectacularly, turning his company into the villain of an international news story. The state investigation, now under intense public and media scrutiny, could no longer maintain its cold, procedural stance. With Sarah Jenkins relentlessly submitting the survivor affidavits and Mark Harrison's article shining a harsh light on every detail, the investigators were forced to acknowledge the overwhelming evidence of Amy's heroism and Oceanic Transit's culpability. The final investigation report was released with unprecedented speed. It was a complete exoneration of Amy. More importantly, it laid bare the truth. The ferry had sunk due to critical mechanical failures, exacerbated by an inadequately trained crew and a corporate culture that prioritized cost-cutting over safety. The report unequivocally praised Amy Vance for her extraordinary courage, selflessness, and professional competence under impossible circumstances. It concluded that her actions had undoubtedly saved multiple lives and significantly mitigated further injury and loss. At the hospital, Dr. Reed and the hospital's legal team, now facing a potential PR disaster and public outrage, quietly, almost shamefacedly, lifted Amy's suspension. Dr. Reed called Amy into her office, a ghost of her former authoritative self. "Nurse Vance," she began, her voice unusually soft, "the board has reviewed the investigation's findings. Your suspension is rescinded. We acknowledge the unique nature of the situation. Your actions, while outside standard protocol, were ultimately commendable." It was as close to an apology as Amy would ever get from Dr. Reed, a grudging concession to the undeniable force of public opinion. The climax came a week later. The Coast Guard, responding to the overwhelming public sentiment and the official report, held a special ceremony. It wasn't just a local affair. National media descended upon the small coastal town. Amy, dressed in a simple but elegant blue dress, stood on a podium overlooking the very waters where the Star of the Sound had sunk. The families of the survivors were there, their faces beaming with pride and gratitude. Robert Henderson, leaning on a cane, managed a shaky but heartfelt smile. Sarah Jenkins stood proudly beside Amy. A high-ranking Coast Guard admiral, his uniform adorned with medals, stepped forward. He spoke with a booming voice that carried over the gentle lapping of the waves. "Today, we are here to honor a true hero. In a moment of unimaginable terror, when instinct told most to flee, Miss Amelia Vance chose to stay. She chose humanity over procedure. She chose courage over self-preservation. She chose compassion over fear. Her actions embody the highest ideals of service and sacrifice." He paused, then continued, his gaze direct and unwavering. "This medal, the Coast Guard Silver Life-Saving Medal, is awarded for extreme and heroic daring in saving life. Miss Vance, you represent the very best of us. You remind us that true heroism is not about following rules blindly, but about answering the call of conscience." He pinned the gleaming medal onto her dress. The crowd erupted in thunderous applause, a wave of genuine admiration and relief that washed over Amy. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were tears of profound vindication, of hard-won honor. Later, away from the cameras and the crowds, Amy stood by the water's edge, holding the heavy, gleaming medal. It wasn't just a piece of metal, it was a symbol of the lives saved, of the battle fought, and of the truth revealed. She had faced down the forces of bureaucracy, corporate callousness, and professional skepticism, and she had emerged victorious. Her journey, born of a desire for escape, had unexpectedly led her to face her deepest fears and affirm her truest calling. She had proven that doing the right thing was always worth the fight, even when the world tried to punish you for it. The inspirational message resonated deeply, made all the more powerful by the frustrating antagonism and injustice she had overcome. The crimson tide had nearly drowned her, but she had risen from it, not just a survivor, but a legend,